Early in the 19th century, a young Englishman, following a passion for unearthing the lost civilizations of the Orient, came upon this structure, uncertain of what he had found. He wrote,
"The very venerable appearance of this ruin instantly awed me. I found that I had no right conception of it. I sat for near an hour on the steps, contemplating it until the light rose on it, and I began to think that this in reality must be the tomb of the best, the most illustrious, and the most interesting of Oriental sovereigns.
The man who sat here in the moonlight in 1821, wondering about its origins, whose tomb it was, leaving his own inscription there, indeed, was Claudius James Rich. Rich died helping to deal with an outbreak of cholera only weeks after reaching here, and just before the tomb was positively identified. This was indeed, as he thought, the tomb of an illustrious Oriental sovereign. But it was so much more than that, too. This was the final resting place of Cyrus the Great. The name of this place was and is Pasargad, deep in the Iranian plateau. The stage, the arena, where so many of mankind's dramas have been played out, as we shall see. This Oriental army is about to challenge the balance of power in the ancient world. It's led by a tribal king virtually unknown outside his own land. His name, Cyrus. What intrigues me about his story is that he was probably the most underrated leader in history. He changed the face of the civilized world, and yet only today is his impact being documented by new archaeological discoveries. For centuries, the Old Testament provided the only clues to the way that Cyrus's empire was conceived and run. The book of Ezra, for example, records how Cyrus, having conquered Babylon, liberated the Jews, restored the temple in Jerusalem. And that was virtually all we knew. Now, with the newly gathered evidence of history, we can discover much more. That's why we're beginning this quest here in the province of Fars, in the heartland of the Persians in the ancient world, because it's here that we can see how history is being fleshed out and reassessed. In these programs, we'll see how history is written and rewritten not just by the men of the time, but by the ingrained perspectives of those who come after and write the history, and how history can be shaped as much by a landscape as by men. From the estuary lands of the Tigris and the Euphrates, a fertile plain ends suddenly in a great escarpment. This is the beginning of the Iranian plateau. The plateau rises first to a level of 4,000 feet, then at its rim into mountain barriers as high as 18,000 feet. These mountains form a kind of elevated bow, and in the center of it are two vast and uninhabitable deserts. But the plateau can be more forgiving. There are oases, fertile plains, and accessible routes across. It was these routes that made the plateau a crucial link, a land bridge between east and west, and which attracted a series of men setting out to conquer the world. First, the most enduring legend of all Western invaders, Alexander the Great. Then the Roman legions. Then a wave of a different kind, driven by the zeal of a new religion which transformed the Near Eastern world, Islam, brought by the Arabs. 6 centuries later, from the Central Asian steppes, the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan. And on the heels of the Mongols, Timur, the Tamburlaine of Western legend, whose trail was marked by pyramids of skulls. And yet this civilization took each blow and recovered. These programs will examine what lessons of survival and renewal may lie buried here for civilizations like ours, and how the recovery of the spirit was expressed in sublime works of art, how destroyers became builders. Voltaire wrote, "I want to know what were the steps by which men passed from barbarism to civilization." And certainly that story began here a very long time ago. People first settled and built a community on this mound around 5000 BC. By 3000 BC, here there was a planned city, Susa. To organize their trade, the people of this city developed a script. It was called cuneiform, to keep their records. There were also gods, worshipped at great temples or ziggurats, like this one built around 1250 BC. Just after 1000 BC, 2 tribes came to the plateau in successive migrations from the Central Asian steppes. First the Medes, then the Persians. The Medes settled in western Iran, and perhaps a century later, the Persians settled in southwestern Iran as subjects of the more powerful Medes. In 550 BC, Cyrus, head of a tribal monarchy called the Achaemenians, or sometimes Achaemenids, led a Persian uprising. In a battle near where his tomb now stands in rural surroundings, he defeated the Median king and then united the two tribes. The united forces of the Medes and the Persians formed the new Achaemenian army that Cyrus led into battle at Sardis, capital of a major Western power, Lydia. The Lydians had developed a sophisticated Mediterranean culture, not unlike the Greeks. Their king, Croesus, lived in extravagant imperial style. Cyrus was 1,600 miles from his base, the province of Anshan on the plateau, and he faced one of the most formidable armies of its day. The elite of the Lydian army were the cavalry. They came out to meet Cyrus on the plain before Sardis, composed and confident. What now follows is a reconstruction of the battle based on the ancient accounts. The Medes and Persians go into battle with little body armor, unlike the Lydians. For Cyrus, this battle is the big gamble, the most dangerous campaign of his life. His lines of communication are gravely extended. He is deep in hostile territory. Only the Medes and Persians stand between Croesus and Lydian ambitions to invade the east. Cyrus is making a desperate preemptive strike. For the Lydians, a whole way of life is at stake, a life of opulent luxury, based on great reserves of gold. One of Cyrus's generals has noticed that Western horses are unfamiliar with camels. Out from the parting ranks of the Persian cavalry comes Cyrus's secret weapon. The Lydian horses have never seen a camel, nor smelt one. Almost exactly as Cyrus calculated, Croesus's cavalry dissolves into chaos. Many of them are left to fight the Persians on the ground, horseless. Before the battle, Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi. A war with Cyrus, he was told, would destroy a great kingdom. And so it had. In the desolation of a battlefield, where the silence of the dead was punctuated only by the sounds of the dying. Sardis itself fell after a siege, and Cyrus was as rich as Croesus. The battle was a turning point in history. The old powers of the ancient world, Egypt, Babylonia, and Lydia, were about to be displaced. A new world in which first Greece and then Rome would dominate the West was about to emerge. In that world, the Persian Empire, as it developed, would become a crucial hinge between East and West. At the heart of the empire was Pasargad, or sometimes Pasargadae, and there I joined the British archaeologist David Stronach to discuss the new evidence about the nature of Cyrus. This is the only known representation of Cyrus the Great in the world, and as you can see, there's only half of it. David, is there still anything we can learn from this maddeningly truncated piece of evidence?
Conceivably something about Cyrus's modesty, for remarkably enough, this representation of the king was not ordered by Cyrus himself, but by his successor Darius, who labeled the representation Cyrus the Great King, the Achaemenian, and who seems to have wished to make good the fact that there was no representation of Cyrus here amidst his own palaces.
You spent a lot of time, of course, digging all around here, and what would you say, David, was the most instructive thing you actually discovered about Cyrus?
I think it was the fastidious quality of the stone workmanship at this site. It's really remarkable the way the craftsmen, even where the work would never be seen, went for quality in a quite extraordinary way. Here's an example. You can see the knife-sharp edges of the column base, the carefully worked horizontal flutes of this torus base, and then when you come into the column, which curves gently up like that, you have these very remarkable small plugs. Can you see?
Yes, yes, I can. That one, there's one that's still
exactly so.
Extant.
Yes. Wherever there was a flaw in the stone, they cut it out, and then they put a polished plug like that, fitting very exactly into place. And when the hole was polished over, it would have been a completely uniform finish.
How much time would you say that Cyrus spent here in the Palace of Audience, David?
Given the very extensive nature of his campaigns, I can hardly imagine he had very much time here.
I suppose the most outstanding campaign was really Babylon?
Yes, and certainly the conquest of Babylon established him as the most powerful monarch of his day.
Though I gather, sadly, we can't altogether credit the account of Herodotus that he drained off the River Euphrates in order to enter by the riverbed.
No. Colourful as the story is, I think it's a little improbable that that happened.
The Western legend shows Babylon brought down by its own decadence, as in this D.W. Griffith classic, Intolerance.
What was the actual ploy that he used, in fact?
Well, I believe that he really deceived the Babylonian army, that with his main force he feinted towards Borsippa, and in fact the real striking force under one of his lieutenants struck directly for Babylon, took the defenders by surprise and entered the city, took it without battle.
In addition to strategy beforehand and his tactics afterwards, because he was always so clever afterwards, wasn't he? For instance, referring to himself always as the king of Babylon in pronouncements to the Babylonians. And the tolerance towards the Jews of Babylon, of course.
Yes, tolerance really, as far as we can see, towards the Babylonians themselves, the Jews and other captive peoples. He returned the statues of the gods to their temples, restored temples that had been allowed to fall into disuse.
And there's that other marvellous phrase too, isn't there, about all the kings coming to pay him tribute from the upper sea to the lower sea. How big was Cyrus's empire at its biggest?
Well, of course, very large indeed. One can't set absolute limits to the empire in the east, but we know he founded a city named after himself, which the Greeks called Syropolis, on the Euxates in Central Asia. It's very possible that he campaigned into northwestern India. Certainly his empire reached to the extreme western edge of Asia Minor, and in the southwest to the gates of Egypt.
At that point, let's take a look at the royal garden, shall we? What did the royal garden look like, David?
Well, we have to imagine these gleaming white stone palaces standing in what was a magnificent park with trees, flowers, water between the main palace buildings. The garden was used much as a Persian garden is today. It's a place to sit and walk and discourse in. It's a very peaceful, almost philosophic place, and the buildings, the pavilions within it, are as much an important part of it as the water, the trees, the flowers.
From the early Persian gardens came the idea and the word of paradise, in this case an earthly one.
The watercourses especially capture the imagination because they're beautifully made of pale limestone with very nicely worked sides, and at regular intervals, every 12 meters or so, square basins where perhaps water lilies or the like could have grown.
The royal gardens drew their water from a river, but water was brought to the desert to grow crops by an innovation called the khanat.
Now you can let your legs come in front of you, together in front of you, and go down like a mountain climber abseiling. That's it, that's it. Haley yavaş berid payin. That's it. Good. That's fine. Yes, that's Just keep holding on.
This particular qanat is about 50 feet deep. The water is about 2 or 3 feet deep and very cool. I know that because I just had to fish my hat out of it. And it's cool and non-evaporating, just as was intended when these qanats were designed. And the whole thing, the whole shaping of them all the way up is just well, a perfect example of a 3,000-year-old technique.
Because it lies deep underground, the khanat cuts the loss from evaporation to a minimum. But keeping it serviceable is a constant task.
With qanats, they dig at the foot of the mountain until they reach the water table. After they've seen that the ground contains water, they dig downwards and along. They advance more and more to where the water is needed on the surface. The length of this qanat consists of 36 shafts, and the shafts are 30 meters apart. The whole qanat runs just less than a mile, but some qanats can run as long as 50 miles. These qanats have to be checked regularly, because it is possible that one of the water courses collapses, and then all these parts here get wet and collapse. They have to be checked regularly, every 10 to 20 days. A person has to come and check it and see that nothing is blocking it and that the water course has not collapsed. Yes, that's how it is with qanats.
And you feel that the reason for the remarkable development of this remarkable invention, indeed, in the period, the Achaemenian period of Cyrus, was due to the stability that people felt secure and safe.
Yes, that was the essential condition. If you don't have a stable, secure condition, then it's useless building something like a qanat, which can be filled and blocked very easily, and which it takes an enormous amount of labor to complete. And the same goes for dams, extensive canal systems, and the other major irrigation works which began to cover the Iranian world at this time.
Even in his 60s, Cyrus was still campaigning in the saddle. He took his army into the mountains of the northeast to subdue a rebel tribe, and there, in battle, he was killed. His body was brought home to the tomb, here at Pasargad.
Well, let's take a look inside, if we may.
Right.
Right. What do we have here? I mean, what was it, when his body was brought back after he was killed and laid here, what did the tomb look like?
Well, the companions of Alexander leave us a description, and they say that there was a golden sarcophagus which stood on a golden couch, and beside it there was a single table, and on the table were certain robes, a sword, and other jeweled ornaments of the king. From the time of his death until the return of Alexander from his Indian campaign in 324 BC, his body lay undisturbed. And then, of course, at that time, the tomb was at last pillaged, parts of the sarcophagus, parts of the body scattered outside the tomb by the robbers.
Well, let's go outside the tomb again and see if we can sum up this remarkable man. How would you write the epitaph of Cyrus the Great?
There are so many things. By the time of his death in 530 BC, he'd changed the face of the civilized world. But I think the point that most deserves to be stressed is his judicious treatment of the many separate peoples under his rule. This introduced a new concept of benevolent government. For the first time, if you like, on a very wide scale, great force was used to protect, not degrade, the human condition. I think he was an extremely able politician, and he saw that if he could win people to his cause, rather than force them to his cause, the way perhaps earlier empires had done, that he would secure the future, as he did, far more effectively.
And a stable rule for his successor, indeed.
Indeed, because so many of the precepts that Cyrus established of allowing a valid degree of autonomy and respecting separate institutions and religions. All this was continued in the later Achaemenian Empire, and of course it was a period of time of prosperity for 200 years, such as the Near East had really never known.
A road ran 1,600 miles from Sardis near the Mediterranean to Pasargad. It was linked by an early version of the Pony Express. Through a series of post stations, a relay of riders could cover the distance in a week. From Pasargad, the road ran south to what became the empire's most awesome landmark, Persepolis. These palaces marked Persian power at its zenith. Through an imperial archway, the gate of all nations, the visitors turned right to face a great hall of audience, the Apadana. Here, at the center of the Apadana, on an elevated throne, sat the most powerful man on earth, Darius.
Joining us now to tell the story of Persepolis for us, and with us, is Professor Richard Fry. Dick, what would have been going on in the days when it was active here in the Gate of All Nations?
Well, this Gate of All Nations, David, I think you must remember, is not just a doorway where people go through. It's an entire complex where the king sat on the throne surrounded by his nobles, and in which he passed out justice. People who would complain, and he would be the sort of supreme court of the kingdom. And this is a very ancient tradition in the Near East. It's quite possible that here in Persepolis it was a kind of symbolic tradition which was maintained, and then later on, when the palaces were built, this was not used. But in any case, it was the obvious thing to have in any palace construction where the king lived.
You are possibly sitting, in fact, where he possibly sat.
Yes, this would be the center, right, equidistant on both sides, as I said, where his nobles would sit on the right and the left, and the officers of the court, and here facing directly across from the Apadana, the main palace.
Now, there are various different theories, aren't there, about why this place was originally built?
Oh, yes, there are, and many controversies about it, too. Some people think that Persepolis was an administrative center, a capital. Others say no, it was a religious center.
It's much bigger, too, than Pasargad, isn't it? I mean, it's so much on a different scale altogether, isn't
Oh,
it?
my, yes. Pasargadi, you have palaces which are put within a park, within a garden, a large garden. Whereas here, it's massive, put upon a platform, especially to show the power and majesty of the empire. And it was highly fortified, too. It was a kind of treasury, a fortress, a palace all combined, and very close together.
At least visitors today know a little of what they're in for when they come to this site, but what did the early travelers, when they came upon it, what must they have thought?
Well, you know that Persepolis was, in a sense, forgotten less than 600 years after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire. In the time of the Sasanian dynasty, several nobles who came by here had a picnic, and they didn't know who had built these magnificent ruins which they saw, but they gave blessings and praise to whoever built these. They didn't know what this was, but they called the place the Sad Situn, the 100 columns. And later on, when the Arabs came, from the Quran, they thought that this must be the palace of Solomon, because only King Solomon could build such a magnificent place with wonderful stones, huge, enormous stones, with the help of the spirits or the jinn. So they called it the throne of Solomon. And then later on, the Persians equated Solomon with their first mythical king, Jamshid, and called it the Takhti Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid. And that's what it was called when the Europeans first came here.
Now, where are we now? We're approaching the Apadana, right? Here?
Yes, we are. And here we find the remarkable scenes on the one side, on the other side of the tribute bearers or the gift bearers. And here we have the soldiers who, probably the immortals, who are guarding the palace.
And these are some of the 10,000 immortals here.
Yes, presumably. And we, as you see, there's something very interesting. The handwork, the craftsmanship, it gives you power, and a feeling of power rather than...
In the reliefs carved at Persepolis, 23 separate peoples are shown offering their allegiance to the great king. Scythians, Libyans, Bactrians, Indians. They brought gifts, and they also brought the diversity of skills which were used to build and to enrich Persepolis. And from Lydia and India, they brought gold. Much of the vast wealth that passed into Persepolis as tribute and taxes stayed there. The Persian kings accumulated a hoard worth thousands of times the wealth of the wealthiest of the Greek states.
درود بر شما. خب از آن دی چند فرسخ است؟
از حاجی آباد 10 فرسخ رفت.
10 فرسخ.
تا اینجا 10 فرسخ رفت.
Where has he come from?
He says 10 farsakhs. That's a long distance.
And I noticed immediately that an Achaemenian rider didn't have stirrups.
That's right. The stirrups weren't invented until about, the 4th or 5th century AD. That's almost 800 or 900 years after this.
And when he comes rocketing along the Royal Road, as he's just done, and hands this over, would he hand over the message normally to you as the person it was addressed to, the receiver, or who?
No, he would probably hand it to the scribe, or the person who would then deliver it to the person and read it for him.
Read it for him?
Yes, read it, in a sense, translate it, because all of these messages were written in Aramaic, the Aramaic language, a Semitic language, and written on skins or on parchment, and would be carried in this way and then delivered to the scribe, who would take it to the king or to a noble to whom it was addressed, and he would read it off, whatever language the man understood, to whom it was delivered.
And how long was the Royal Road along which the messenger would have travelled? I mean, he might not have come all the way, I realise, but it was, what, 1,600 miles? Was it?
Long distance from Sardis to Susa, and then beyond up here to Persepolis and Pasargadae.
And how long to cover that 1,600 miles? If a message had to go from one end to the other by a rider like this, not one rider all the way, but how long would it take?
The sources say that a courier going day or night, of course they would transfer the message from one to another after 8 or 9, 10 hours of riding, would come from Sardis to Susa in about a week, the night and day riding, and a caravan would take 3 months.
Well, anyway,
Enormous.
Would you thank him for bringing our message anyway?
سپاس گذارم. خدا حافظ باشد. زود.
The king's eyes and ears were everywhere. He divided the empire into regions called satrapies, and from each came the satraps to report, touching their lips in homage. The king himself decided what each satrapy could bear in taxes, and in return he gave security. To add equity to security, the Rayas gave the empire a universal set of laws, known in the Bible as the law which altereth not. The Rayas examined his own nature and said,
I am not hot-tempered. What things develop in my anger, I hold firmly under control by my thinking power.
He won the throne only after putting down 19 rebellions. He marked these victories by carving a record of them on a cliff face. Darius surveys his foes, strung out before him as captives, and shows them no mercy.
Phraortes, seized, was led to me. I cut off his nose and ears and tongue and put out one eye. He was kept bound at my palace entrance, all the people saw him. Afterwards, I impaled him at Ecbatana, and the men who were his foremost followers I flayed and hung out their hides stuffed with straw.
The empire, established by Cyrus, was extended by Darius into the largest the world had known, and a canal was built linking the Red Sea to the Nile 2,400 years before the Suez Canal. What bound this empire together was the will of the great king. Only one people successfully resisted it, the Greeks. The Greeks and the Persians, like the Europeans, sprang from a common racial stock. Their languages had a common root, but the two powers, Greek and Persian, had become irreconcilable. Darius's army invaded Greece, but was beaten at Marathon. His son, Xerxes, met a similar fate at Salamis, having first burnt the Acropolis at Athens, an act that came home to roost later at Persepolis.
To any Greek invader, Persepolis would be both a target and a symbol of power which invited retribution. Here, overlooking Persepolis, outside one of the royal tombs cut into the rock face above the site, we've asked Dr. Shapur Shahbazi to join us to help to give us an overview, not just of Persepolis, but of the whole Achaemenian period. Shapur, what would you say is the reason for the relative neglect of the Achaemenians in Western history?
I suppose one could start with looking into the ancient texts. The very fact that all we have is Western about the Achaemenids. We have Roman, Greek, and mainly Greek, a bit of Hebrew, and whatever we have also from the ancient materials have been deciphered by the Western, and therefore interpreted by the Western scholars. What we have to take into account is that the Achaemenids, after their downfall, were even neglected by Persians themselves. So it is really not a fault of the Westerners who neglected them.
Let me say that the Greeks had the concept that everybody who was non-Greek was a barbarian, both to the west and to the east. And this did not exist, of course, in the Achaemenid Empire. Nobody was a barbarian. So you had a different feeling. The Greeks really didn't think very much of people who were non-Greek.
The barbarian to Greek meant somebody who could not understand Greek language, be it a Thracian or a Persian or a Roman. So really, barbarian did not mean savage or somebody who was cruel or brutal, something which we understand from modern Western textbooks. And this is to be understood. Indeed, the Persians did not know anything about being brutal and cruel in the eyes of the Greeks, or vice versa. And this, in the time of Xerxes, is so fascinating that somebody in such an authority understood that the Persians and the Greeks were blood related.
Do you think it's simply a case of East is East and West is West, and there will always be two versions of history?
No, I don't think so, because we're learning more and more today about differences, about the different ways of looking at things. And I think that as time goes on and we get more information, because archaeologists yearly are turning up new data for us, and that we're beginning to understand more and more the different points of view, and also not to pass judgment. You know, we in the West believe that history started in Egypt and Babylonia, and then was passed on very briefly to the Achaemenids, went on to the Greeks, then to the Romans, then to Western Europe, and history somehow didn't exist in the rest of the world. It was sort of outside of the theater. We've got a very linear view of the development from the ancient Near East to Western Europe, and that forgets the rest of the world. And we've completely forgotten the Far East, India, and lots of other civilizations, and I think we are learning more and more that there are other ways of looking at things.
Everywhere in the atmosphere at Persepolis we found, as others have, an unmistakable lingering sense of some lost greatness, the token of a moment when civilization was organized for the first time on a new scale that transcended divisions of race, religion, or nationality.
The great king rested in a place more secure than Persepolis. Darius was buried across the plain in a tomb overlooking the heart of his kingdom.
The Achaemenid Empire did not survive for more than a few generations after it reached its limits under Xerxes. It was destroyed, as we shall see, by Alexander the Macedonian. These tombs were sacked. The memory of this empire and the identity of its creators lost, erased for more than 2,000 years. But the civilization founded by Cyrus and Darius was to outlive many of its contemporaries and successors. And even Darius's epitaph here at Nakhchi-Rustan enshrines the ethic inaugurated by Cyrus at the founding of the empire.
I am a friend to right. I am not a friend to wrong. It is not my desire that the weak man should have wrong done to him by the mighty, nor that the mighty man should have wrong done to him by the weak. What is right, that is my desire. Me may Ahura Mazda protect from harm, and my royal house, and this land.
در دومین قسمت از چهار راه تمدن، حمله اسکندر مقدونی به ایران رو به کمک چند باستانشناس از زوایای مختلف بررسی می‌کنیم.
But his major crime was burning Persepolis.
Alexander is the son of evil.
Most brilliant conqueror.
History makes no judgment, only historians make judgment.